Hello, this is Native Art Department with Maintaining Good Relations. We're at our Positive Outcomes segment. The music here was a Brazilian band presented by my good friend Dobby Leventhal. I don't have the name of the band. I'll bring that back at some point. But he is responsible for presenting that wonderful song that got our energy back up. We're now talking to Maya Suess.
Hi.
Hi, Maya. Why don't you introduce yourself briefly, and then we'll begin.
Okay, yeah. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you guys today. I really enjoyed that last conversation. So my name is Maya Suess. I'm the managing director at the Flux Factory. Flux Factory. We don't actually have a "the" before it, but sometimes I like to, emphasize. So Flux Factory is a artist in residency space and public exhibition space based in Long Island City, Queens. This is our third building. We've moved around for various reasons, which I'm happy to go into at some point. And we were originally founded in the early 90s by a group of artists that moved into a space and were looking for an affordable place to be and to make work in this complicated, very complicated space relationship that we have with New York City. And it is really an artist-run space. It's a collective, so there are very few admin, and then a group of sort of moving artists that come through the space and have been, and we all together sort of create what is known as Flux Factory.
I've known your space, the group, largely as artists. The context is of artists who do collaborative works. Mm-hmm. I don't know if maybe that's just one facet. Would you mind just helping me out by going through maybe some of your programming or some of your previous programming, touching upon the kind of work that reflects the ethos and values of your organization?
Yeah, well, I think one thing that's different about Flux Factory as a residency program is that we don't have a lot of emphasis on sort of final projects and final results of what might be created. I mean, we have a lot of work that comes out of Flux Factory. There's like probably more than one event a week. But the real emphasis is just on connection and community. So the heart of the space itself is this big kitchen on the top floor. And it's got a long table and a big stove and a couple of fridges, and that's really where a lot of things sort of are generated. So the artists come in with all different sorts of works of their own. We have people who are sort of solitary painters, and then we have people who do a lot of explorations of community, social practice type work, and sort of everything in between, including like gardeners and community activists and writers and so forth. But really what we see ourselves as a little bit of an incubator and just a place where people can share ideas and cross-pollinate and kind of meet each other. I've only been there for just under 2 years now, so I don't have that long of a history. You should be speaking with Jean Barberis, who was there for 10 years as the original artistic director. But what I have seen in the 2 years is an amazing sort of flow of artists that come in, often from places around the country, around the world, from New York City, and land in this sort of little hub of collectivity. And then there's these like amazing connections that just sort of happen organically. And that's what we really want to allow, is to kind of provide the resources and the space for artists to find those collective spaces. So I think you're right about that, and it's really just about giving people the kind of space to be able to play. And so because we have musicians and we have painters and we have performers, there's sort of it's bound to just kind of bump up against each other, have a conversation, try something that you haven't tried before. So our longest running program is called Flux Thursday, and that's a potluck program. So it's like every second Thursday of the month. It's a food-based program. It's a potluck. We invite people to come and bring stuff. Usually something big is cooked in the large kitchen. And then there's some sort of programming. So it's a program with whatever, any sorts of things that might be related to the exhibition that's on at that time. There may be a panel of artists are invited to come and speak on a certain topic. This past week, we had Stephen McLeod, who's a Toronto-based artist who's in residence currently. And he's working on sort of a long-term program that has to do with choirs and singing and technology. He's going to have many, many monitors. But this just gave him an opportunity to be like, I've never actually directed a choir before. I've never actually had a bunch of people in a room and them all trying to sort of sing some random thing together. So the Flux Thursday happened. I was not able to go to that event because there's so much happening at Flux that I miss a lot. But I talked a lot to Stephen afterwards. And he was so nervous beforehand. But that's the kind of beauty of, like, we have this program, the community comes, people know that every second Thursday of the month there's this event. People came and they sung together. And it gave him an opportunity in sort of a low-stakes way to really try out new things and to grow and build ideas that here is going to apply to sort of the longer-term project that he's working on.
Okay.
I think there's not a lot of spaces like that in the current art
There's
community.
less and less.
There's less and less, yeah. And I think because of the market, because of the sort of financial pressures that we all find ourselves in as artists, I know as an artist and from the community that surrounds me, I see people really feeling like we need to produce. And sort of the space of play and experimentation and exploration gets farther and fewer and less accessible. So that's what I really love about Flux Factory, is because we really want to offer that space to artists.
Maya, I have to say how great it is to be sitting here, having our voices recorded together as part of positive outcomes. So thank you for joining us here at Maintaining Good Relations. No, I know we're still going. I was just acknowledging how happy I am to be here.
It sounded like a summation. I was like, what's
Not
going on over there?
summation. I'm just
And then the keyboard music kicks in.
celebrating this moment together. So one of the things I think as someone living, perhaps if there's a listener outside of New York who might be listening to this, is that New York is a very big place.
That's true.
Can you talk a little bit about location as destination, or how the neighborhood in which Flux Factory is placed? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So yeah, anyone listening from outside New York's really 5 cities in one. There's the 5 boroughs. And I guess over the years, Manhattan has really been sort of seen as the central hub which everything feeds into. And lately, that's becoming a real problem because, as we know, people aren't necessarily just traveling from outer boroughs into Manhattan anymore. Yeah. There's people are working in where the boroughs where they live, and things are sort of it's been shifting in so many ways for so many reasons. Flux Factory started in Brooklyn, in Williamsburg in the 90s, and then in I think about 2000 moved over to sort of the border of Long Island City and Sunnyside in Queens, and then had to move that location via eminent domain over to where we are now, and that was in 2008. We arrived in the building we're in now in 2009, which is a greeting card factory. Our landlord is still this grandson of the original owner of the greeting card factory. So we're one of the, we're post-industrial space. Long Island City, though, is the fastest growing residential neighborhood in the country. So I know there's just, if you see it, there's just these huge towers going up all around us. We are currently renting our building, but we are exploring the idea of buying it to have a long-term sort of stability within our community. We've been in this neighborhood since 2009, and we're right next to a lot of different train stations, so we're like one stop in from Manhattan, but still there's a sort of like Queens, people from other boroughs sometimes have sort of like, what, going to Queens? But I think more and more we love, I hope that we really become known to our Queens community more and more, and we are. We are collaborating with different organizations in Queens, and we co-founded a community garden across the street with the school. I know, and with the neighborhood association, and I feel like I think having to move a lot is one of the real problems with this kind of real estate market and housing problem. It doesn't allow us to invest in really make roots that we can sort of put down long term. And I really feel like we're part of this community of Queens and Long Island City, and it would be so heartbreaking to me if we had to find some other place.
I agree. Actually, you're synonymous with the Queens Arts, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
A real oasis. Creativity.
Well, Queens is an amazing place, and it really is, they say the most diverse zip code in the world. And I think sometimes it's hard to cross these boundaries between communities, and I think more and more, that really is something that we want to do more. We are in many ways. There's lots of local Queens artists that are part of our residency, and we try to we're free. All of our exhibitions are free, and we engage in a lot of different Queens communities in different ways. But I really want that to be a sort of underlining part of who we are and who we're going to be in the future, because that's really important to me.
So I also know you first and foremost as an artist. Mm-hmm. So as an active cabaret performer, someone who is exceptional with colored pencil crayons or colored
pencils.
Colored
as
pencils.
They call them down here.
And then excellent drafts person. Can you talk a little bit about your art practice a little bit?
Oh, wow. Thanks, Maria. Yeah, I did come out of cabaret and performance, and that was sort of my mainstay for a long time. And in the last number of years, I've been making drawings, as you noted. And it's an interesting thing to try to figure out how to balance being a full-time arts administrator and a visual artist. That's challenging. It's a challenge that I'm sort of up against right now. I'm part of the shift residency at Elizabeth Foundation, which is specifically for artists who are also arts administrators.
I believe that Maria has a exhibition coming up there in 2018 called Response.
That's right. Elizabeth Foundation for the Arts has been fantastic in supporting
wonderful place.
Many and as a site where they have ongoing commitment to artists who are native. The project is #Call Response, which is coming out of Canada, but this will also be here in the U.S. So thinking about these ideas of reconciliation and what that means in a country where that is far, far distant, not even a word known on the horizon. So I think I'm looking forward to grappling that next.
Yeah, the Elizabeth Foundation is a great place, and the shift residency specifically is a really interesting program, just giving us an opportunity to have these conversations with fellow artists, arts administrators, and I think for me it sort of mirrors a bit of a challenge of being the arts administrator and working with artists, where we all have these sorts of balances that we have to make to figure out how we can continue to be artists in this complicated capitalist moment. And so for me, I get to explore it both through my own practice, working in the shift residency, giving me this sort of designated space to do that, and also asking that question all the time as an administrator, working with the artists that come through Flux Factory, and how to sort of provide support, whether or not it's affordable space, and opportunities like exhibitions and studio visits, but also there's all of these ways that I love that Flux provides sort of unexpected opportunities for people through the large network. I think one of the best things about Flux Factory is this huge community that sort of continues to grow every year. So one of my favorite sort of anecdotes about that was one of long-term Flux resident who lives in Beijing right now. She was in San Francisco, and she sent an email to the community list. So as soon as you become a resident, you get on this community list, and it just keeps She sent an email, "Hey Fluxies, like, who's in San Francisco?" And I think immediately 18 people responded.
Right.
And so, you can't underestimate the power of human networks and support sometimes. And I feel like that's what one of our really greatest strengths is just to help provide that space where people can meet each other in a way that's playful and exploratory.
So how long have you been in New York now? I think nearly as we've been here the same amount of time.
I moved back. Well, I moved here in 2000. I was here for a year to go to school, and then I went back to Canada. I'm also Canadian, growing up in Vancouver.
We have a quorum of Canadians at the table right
That's
now.
right.
Jason
We are
stepped away,
owning
so
the
we have 3
table.
Canadians.
Hey.
Stepped
I think we can hold a vote now.
Yeah,
right?
what should we vote on?
Is weed legalized yet?
Maria? By this summer, apparently. I don't know.
No,
Oh, we
sorry.
should pick one.
Why don't you pick one, Maya,
All right, you picked
from the bowl of hosts?
We're voting to legalize.
Roosevelt's equestrian statue.
Oh, that's a bad thing to legalize from outside the
And read
Museum
the
of
rest of
Natural
it.
History.
Wait, that's all it says.
That's all it says.
Oh, that.
Well, we'll legalize for now. We'll put
Pull another one from
Okay.
the bowl.
Okay, should I
Don't put it
put
back,
it back
in,
in?
the bowl. No.
Okay.
No,
I
we don't,
feel
we
like
don't want that one
could,
back.
We could yeah.
Today your host is.
I feel this one, I like the feeling of this. Okay, so I just pulled, oh boy. What? I think this is drawing us Andrew Jackson's portrait hanging in the Oval Office.
That's today. That's the host of your segment. I'm sorry.
That's the host of our
boy.
segment.
I don't know how I feel about that.
Yeah,
Do you
he's the worst.
Do you want one
Yeah.
more?
Well, yeah, now we have
Now you have a
these
sponsor.
two sitting together, right? The statue, the equestrian statue, and the portrait. So I feel like that is a very large and long conversation that we should have others speaking to.
Sure.
Oh, you're doing a sponsorship.
We're doing a third sponsorship.
Third.
I
Okay.
didn't like the first.
Bear's Ears.
That's it.
That's it.
Sponsored by Bears Ears.
Sponsored by Bear's Ears. Yeah.
So you did a good job when you came here of landing on your feet, because you also were working for a while at the print studio.
Yeah, I was a member of the Gowanus studio space for quite a long time. I moved here in 2007 to answer that question, and then I was briefly in Toronto, but I've been here for, just about 10 years now. And the Gowanus studio space is a really amazing collective space in the Gowanus area of Brooklyn. And there's a really wonderful print studio there, wood shop, and also like a sort of studio collective where a lot of amazing artists get together and do things. So collectives seem to be my one of the things I've done in my life, one of the groups, part of the sort of formatting structure of organizing principles that I really appreciate. At Flux Factory, we do our best to be horizontally organized. So everything is transparent to all the residents in terms of our financials and so forth. We have the board, and all the residents are invited out to the board meetings and try to bring all major decisions to the meetings. We have a Monday meeting every Monday where we eat food together and talk about everything from, who's not doing the dishes to what exhibitions are coming up and how to work on fundraising. So it's an interesting process to really bring people into the sort of internal workings of the organization, and sometimes a challenging one.
Thank you, Maya. You're such a team player.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Well, we're joined now by Ben Davis for our next segment. Ben is the National Art Critic for ArtNet, and his 2013 book, 9.5 Theses on Art and Class, hit us and reminded us to return a discussion of class politics to the center of artistic discourse, and not to merely allay the art world as a external factor, but rather as an extremely political one. And I'm hoping today to engage Ben in his depth of knowledge on the global and local art world, to bring up some questions about what some international display practices can mean in relationship to some of the themes of today's themes of ethnic difference, the visibility of indigeneity, and the utilization of primitivisms towards a ruling class structure. So thank you for joining us, Ben.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So I want to jump straight into a bit of a callback to May, which was the Venice Biennale this year.
Sure.
In some ways, the Venice Biennale was very exciting this year because it brought in a ton of indigenous artists and never before exhibited artists on a global scale. People like Kanangatak Puruguk, who was the first Inuit artist, exhibited at Venice. But there were also some problematics with the show that you pointed out in your, what I thought was one of the better takes on the exhibition, namely that there'd been this return to a kind of primitivism or a kind of anthropological emphasis and discussion of non-Western cultures. Sort of if you can describe some of the art that you were thinking about when you saw that mode, particularly as it came into the main exhibition of the Biennale.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's the kind of show where it really makes you wonder, and this year's Documenta was very similar in a lot of senses, where you kind of go through this show and appreciate it for what it's doing, but then it also has this huge question mark over it, where it's like every good thing it does almost seems like it's undermined by the form of it itself. You know, it's like it encompasses a great deal of new voices, kinds of voices from communities that you don't usually see in those kind of spaces, but almost by just the way the show is set up, takes them out of their context. You know, it's really the problem of contextualization, the kind of context that those kinds of shows provide is one that I don't think has been adequately solved, you know? So specifically in the piece that, there are a number of pieces in the show that you could talk about, but really it's this Ernesto Neto piece that was a real centerpiece of the show. The show, for people who didn't see it, was divided into these kind of chapters, thematic chapters, and in the heart of the show there was a space called it was dedicated to shamans, you know, different kind of arts that invoked the idea of the shaman. And at the very center of that was this work by the Brazilian artist, very famous Brazilian artist, Ernesto Neto, who usually works with sort of soft forms full of scented herbs and so on. And in this case, he's been working with a tribe in Brazil. By all accounts, is actually pretty sincerely committed to raising visibility for their struggles. But the entire way it was presented was this kind of ayahuasca lounge that sometimes was used to have actual ceremonial function. Sometimes was used as a kind of chill out space for people with their tourists and they plug in their smartphone.
It read as almost VIP lounge in kind of the affect of the cushions.
I don't even think that was just me reading it. I mean, that's how people read it. I mean, that's how people interacted with it. And then he'd sort of written these poems on the wall that had this, really take you aback with the kind of language they use. It's like, these people are pure. They are nature. They are my voice. They will redeem us. And really kind of a return to the noble savage kind of language. And I started by talking about contextualization. To me, it just was like, oh, this is a French curator. This is a kind of way of a mode of presentation, that I don't think would fly in the United States. I think, and French friends of mine were like, oh, that's so Magicians de la Terre, you know?
That's exactly
it's
what I was
taking us right back. So you do become aware that the conversation about these things is in very different places and different parts of the globe. And that just raises all these unresolved questions about how you relate to the material and how you evaluate it, how you evaluate the show as a whole.
Yeah, and there were 2 points that struck me. I was going to also bring up Magician de la Terre, and I wonder, we brought up Hal Foster's artist as ethnographer in relation to Durham earlier in the show, and I wonder to what extent we're just throwing back to really 3 decades prior when Foster made that first critique, which is that artists are taking up this anthropological lens and overly identifying with it and overly romanticizing it and not being critical enough to dismantle what they're doing in favor of trying to find some sort of non-Western, anti-modern savior position. And then also, I couldn't help but, especially the relationship to the ayahuasca that you brought up, which is the ways that commodities and capital have infiltrated even indigenous rituals and protocols. And I'm thinking currently of everything from the very large industry of shamanistic tourism that essentially has hotels in South America where tourists can go and have ayahuasca retreats and engage with shamans to properly trip.
Well,
or
so-
even Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop sells shaman
Yeah.
kits
Shaman kits.
for like hundreds of dollars. It's incredible. So we have at once this return to a primitivism for the sake of escape from modernity and its crush, but also the hyper-commodification of those promises as well.
Well, yeah. So I was revisiting that text because you told me you wanted to talk about that text. I was looking at what I'd written about that show, and kind of thinking about what is really the problem with it, right? I mean,
yeah.
because it's like, I saying that I don't know a heck of a lot about Ernesto Neto's social life in Brazil, but. Like if we take it as that it's a sincere gesture of awareness raising, he wants to raise awareness about the horrible treatment of Native peoples in Brazil, and this is the vehicle. This kind of what's the problem with that, and part of it is relates to what you just said, right? Is that it fantasizes that there's this like pure. In a way, it presents this image of this kind of pure thing you could be related to that'll redeem you. But in the act of doing that, it's like selling it back to you. It's like inserting it into this kind of space, which then leaves it open to all the things that you're talking about, to become like this exoticized object that instead of preserving it becomes some kind of ethnological fascination for people, becomes some kind of tourist fantasy. So you kind of destroy the thing in the process of trying to speak up for it. And I do think that in the end, there's the kind of rhetoric of like awareness, raising awareness and stuff is overused. That we need to kind of move beyond that and talk about what is the point? Like, to what end are we raising awareness about these things? What social processes does it result in? What organizational practices is it inserted to? Because I think most artists have what I call the message in a bottle theory of political art. That it's like you're an activist by the fact that you spotlight some cause, and then you just kind of put it out into the world and hope that it goes out into the ocean of social life and someone eventually picks it up. And I don't think, particularly in a world so overwhelmed with information flows, that I don't think we can get away with that anymore. If we could, we couldn't either. 30 years ago, people were writing critiques of primitivism.
Yeah, and it also brings up for me the critique of the politics of recognition, which is fairly regular in Canadian art discourses, brought up especially by Glenn Coulthard, who's a Canadian Dene political theorist, which essentially argues that the new colonial mode has no longer been to openly oppress and subject, but to recognize, and that recognition, even though it seems very liberal and lovey-dovey on the outside, is actually just masking some of the continued oppressions that happen.
That's really interesting. I mean, I think that, to use a really overused like Marxist mode of talking, it's like I think it's dialectical. I think you actually need a pretty dialectical way of thinking about this thing, because that's true, and there's this kind of like radical critique of multicultural discourse.
Exactly.
In the way pluralism is. Jeff Chang has a really good book, Who He Be, which is all about how multiculturalism went from being like a kind of a dissident practice to being co-opted by corporate interests. But I think it's really always like both at once. You kind of have to keep your eye on the ball, because on the one hand, I think power still does. The structures that we live in still does operate by marginalization. Then there's always there's a reaction that's all about representation as such. Like, we need more seats at the table. But if the conversation you're having around the table is still the same table, then the powers that led to the marginalization in the first place remain untouched. And so there tends to be, I mean, if you look at the 100-year scope of these conversations about like decentering the European way of thinking about these things, it's like more of a wave function than anything else.
Absolutely.
Where on the one hand, you go through these cycles where it's like we have you speak up for women, for instance. We want more women at the table. We do want more women at the table, but then it's like it becomes a tokenistic gesture. It becomes captured in the same kind of conversation, and then as the attention fades away, because we think we've got that covered, then suddenly 10 years later, you suddenly realize that like marginalization has crept back in either through sins of omission or sins of commission. And it's just always how it's been. There's this wave. And I think that kind of wave function, that you can both have a critique of the kind of pluralistic discourse, the way it's instrumentalized, while still acknowledging that it's an instrument in like some kind of struggle we're having over recognition. You can kind of have to keep both terms, your eye on both terms.
Yeah, you can acknowledge that in the case of Kanaganak Pudaguk, it's incredible for a Inuk artist to be at the Venice Biennale
Absolutely.
and to be recognized, while also acknowledging that the works that were chosen were certainly, just like they were in the beginnings of Inuit printmaking, applying to a certain kind of romantic interest on the parts of the white patrons. And I wonder, shifting to Documenta this year, which had Candace Hopkins, a fantastic curator.
Absolutely.
One of the great Indigenous curators working today independently. She had the fantastic show of Bo Dick Works, who also passed this year, and a phenomenal series of masks that were deeply personal, and that her goal was to bring in a kind of indigenous epistemology and ritual into that setting. But at the same time, how do you feel that that representation and that giving that place to those works operated amongst the broader questions of Athens and the parachuting of Documenta into this context?
I mean, so if you compare the two big shows on the grand tour this year, so Venice, I think, is sort of like a B- show or something like that. You know, it's like a success, but just not that interesting of a success. Like, it has a lot of interesting things in it. It kind of falls flat. It's a little bit confused, but you know, I feel like Documenta is a much more weird, troubling, maybe a failure of a show, but much more interesting in the kind of questions it raises along these lines. Because whereas I would say that Christine Massel in Venice is almost like she's just replicating what people critiqued about Magicians de la Terre, you know, decades ago.
It was very French.
It's very French, kind of like French kind of hippie, kind of sub-hippie discourse. But, you know, Documenta, to their credit, they're completely thinking about this. Like, how do you present these? How do you decenter Europe, and like, how do you decenter Germany, and take in all these things? And it ends up being a bit of a mess. But to me, it is like much more directly a mess, because it's like trying and failing to think about, what do you do with those Bo Dick masks? I mean, they're one of my highlights of the show. But on the other hand, I don't have any. I freely admit, I have very little context for them. I can read what Candace wrote about them, which she wrote a lot of great stuff. But how do you know? It's like, in some senses, it just all does. The nature of that kind of event becomes a kind of just mixtape or a playlist of just interesting stuff coming at you that becomes a little bit flattened out. And I think that they were actually trying to rub your face in that. I mean, I think that's the curatorial gambit there, is that this is you're going to feel how confused you are.
Right.
And you're going to feel like you don't belong a little bit. That's an interesting curatorial gesture. In some ways, you know, pushes me back honestly into the position where it's like, oh yeah, I better do some homework on Bo Dick, you know? But on the other hand, does that do justice? That was my question coming out of the show. Does that do justice? Is that really making the show more about the guilt of the European center at the expense of telling the stories of people who are just now being able to tell their story?
And the question for works like those by Bo Dick, a Kwakwakiwak artist who passed away in the spring, these are typically masks that have a lot of ritual and a lot of private property associated with them. Property in the sense of intangible and hereditary property. Particular people have the right to dance some of the masks that he carves, and I think that fact alone, and the ritual component of them, and the fact that many of them were meant to be burnt and then remade after they were used, would just be impossible for the average museum or documentary goer to pick up when they're all aesthetically displayed in the rooms like they were.
Absolutely. And you know, and the more I research that show, the more I'm like pretty sure, you know, that, and this is generally the case in contemporary art. It's a presentational problem with presenting contemporary art in bulk, is that it's very story specific. Everybody has, it's very much like you have to enter into a world. That's the strength of it, really, is that it provides a space to where you can like find people's specific context. But yeah, I'm pretty sure I'm pretty sure Bo Dick, I did a lot with Idle No More. Correct me.
Oh yeah,
I think he did major protests in Vancouver.
Yep, he did a copper breaking ceremony on the steps of the British Columbia provincial government, where he broke a ceremonial copper, which is a great sign of wealth and prestige amongst Kwakwaka'wakw, and was banned by the chiefs because it caused so much strife within the communities. And then he traveled with that to then break it on the steps of Parliament.
So in that, exactly, the documented here is like, it's called Learning from Athens. It's very political, and in some ways it's like the whole thing is about what is political? What does political art look like? What does a political art practice looks like? And, when you read about Bo Dick's actual kind of life praxis, you're like, oh my goodness, this is like a tremendous contribution to that conversation. But none of that's visible there.
Yeah.
So the question, and in a way, it's kind of about it. It's about its invisibility. Yes, it's in the act of gaining visibility, you kind of lose tangibility.
Yeah, and someone like Bo Dick would say that simply living and being present is a political act for an Indigenous person. And to continue to create culture in the times that he would be a political act. As you know from Candace's text, many of those masks were illegal in Canada due to the potlatch ban from 1884 to 1951. So to have them survive at all in the knowledge that's produced through the carving of these masks is a deeply colonial and political, or anti-colonial and decolonizing act. We have just a few minutes left, so I just want to bring in one recent piece that you've written, which was about the rise of the art right and Trumpism. And the tangent that I'm going to jump to on this is just to try and tie some of what you wrote in that piece, critiquing the critique of Trump's poor taste as a poor version of political analysis, and try and tie some of the extremely tasteful and high-flying collectors that support Trumpism and therefore support a very xenophobic ethno-nationalism, which, as you've shown, is very present in the art world as a politic. And so I wonder, at these global exhibitions, even as there is this greater visibility of artists like Bo Dick, even as he's noticed by people like Roberta Smith at art fairs, when a certain class is collecting work by minority artists and Indigenous artists in particular who support a ethno-nationalism, how does that work operate against that, and can it?
Well, one of the themes of my writing is that art is never by itself a form of politics. It's always, the question is always what else is happening around it, or what it's embedded in. And to go back to the dialectic that we were talking about earlier, I mean, I think there's a constant push-pull between these things where you just have to very empirically and keep your wits about you in judging where the conversation is at. Because on the one hand, I mean, representation itself is a form of politics in some cases. But on the other hand, it's also, and particularly in art, like that's, that's our bread and butter. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about like forms of representation, how it's presented. But on the other hand, it's like converting a political discussion into a symbolic discussion about representation, where it's like, oh yeah, I support Indigenous people. Like I've got a mask on my wall. It's like that is the easiest way to diffuse conversations. And I think that I think that's something that we need to keep. What I was trying to say in this essay that you're talking about for the Baffler, which is that I think that when people obsess, and Trump is an excessive, disgusting, vile character. It's easy to obsess on his vulgarity, tackiness, the sheer barbarism of what he's doing. But that leaves us open to letting a lot of like nasty stuff slip in under the guise of just that it's better looking, it's more presentable, it speaks our language, it talks, uses all the right buzzwords, including people who literally support him, who are not on our, who they just speak the lingo. And so we just need to keep both in mind. I think this should be the starting point for the conversation.
That's great. I think we'll make that the end point of our conversation right here.
Great. Well, thank you for
so
having
much,
me.
Ben, for joining
Thank
us.
you, Ben. And if you stick around, maybe we could talk about Terrence Simon.
Um,
All right, so I'm going to welcome my guests, Arthur Polendo, and we're joined by a surprise guest, Akiko Ichikawa, who's one of our visitors. Akiko. Thank you. That's great.
And that section with Ben was actually hosted by General William Tecumseh Sherman's golden statue at the south end of Central Park. As General Sherman said, we must act with vindictive earnestness against the Sioux, even to their extermination. And the sponsor for that section was the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Please don't drill in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you. Just please don't drill. So we have, I had mentioned earlier that this is Arthur Polendo. Arthur, why don't you, he's a principal member of Occupy Museums, founding member of Debt Fair, and a visual artist.
Yes, one of the core founding members of Debt Fair.
So why don't you talk a little bit about yourself? One of the things I was curious about was how a person who's known as an artist, primarily, how you chose to become involved not only in being a member of an activist art movement, but also as a founding member of a separate, maybe somewhat related movement, but it's still a separate endeavor. Why don't you talk to me about the history of this and the history of your own involvement?
Sure. I began studying as a fine artist, painting, drawing, printmaking also in undergraduate. I went to California College of the Arts. Also did some visiting scholar to Paris École des Beaux-Arts and graduate school at School of the Art Institute of Chicago in painting and drawing. And in Chicago, I was involved with Chicano or Mexican descent, and I was involved with some of the Pilsen neighborhood. Then now it's more like run by artists and galleries more now at this point, but then it was a little more grittier, a little more Mexican neighborhood. I was involved in a few of those shows with a friend, Ricardo Santos Hernandez, where we did partake in some Latino and Mexican American shows, and also the first Mexican American show at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in the Betty Reimer Gallery. I taught and moved back to San Antonio, Texas, which is over 50% Latino, specifically of Mexican descent, and taught for a while there, and I started to feel this sort of adjunct, I won't say trapped or limitations or restrictions in teaching fine art at the college level, where I thought ways to get out, and was showing there and doing a couple of DIY galleries and setting up myself, putting up shows physically, but I thought the idea to transfer out of that to maybe land a full-time teaching gig would be beneficial. To pursue a PhD in fine art critical studies at Texas Tech University in Lubbock. And there actually I was involved in a lot of cross-disciplinary courses, and I also worked with Dr. Ed Check and taught for several semesters called Rethinking Art Education, where it was teaching education majors that were going to be teaching K through 12 and ways to approach students in lesson plans involving how to include social justice, equality, bringing up gender, race, economic class, and allowing for a lot of discussions, including art projects, where they could be involved in this as well. But basically from there, after I completed my coursework and studies, and I had my dissertation proposal accepted, which involved examining Chicano identities in 3 works, or 3 artists, 2 in San Antonio and 1 in Chicago, all living, all dealing in public art, and all incorporated the human figure in their work. I moved to New York, and that was in 2009, in the middle of that. And I've been here since then, but also in some cross-disciplinary classes at Texas Tech, also involved courses in public art and sort of how crowds deal with architecture and public art space, and that sort of led into, all of that sort of fed into when I, in New York, in 2011, started visiting the Occupy Wall Street camps and whatnot.
Okay, well, that's really interesting. But you came here originally, you moved to New York to be an artist or to be an arts professional initially?
Yes, they obviously New York City is one of the key places to see artwork, and I visited here 6 times before, so I knew it was what I was getting into in the gallery opportunities, and of course lots of museums and do-it-yourself, and certainly that was the goal.
I guess what I'm interested in is how do you go from arriving and becoming interested in what's happening downtown with the Occupy movement to assisting with projections on the side of the Guggenheim, or moving from just being a component with movement to actually being a more integral part of actions and maybe having a decision in these actions?
Well, actually, I was working at the Metropolitan Museum of Art as when I started out in as retail and also as a guard for a limited number of months, and several friends were commenting about the Occupy Wall Street camps and how they were going down there, and different meetings are taking place, and I became involved in going to some of those meetings. And in 2011 the Halloween parade was forming, and I joined up with the Puppet Guild, and I was, along with another individual, headed this construction of a 14-foot tall robot called Slotbot, involving economic, it was a giant slot machine with a movable head and lights and 20-foot arm, and someone could get inside and wheel around, and people were pulling them throughout the Halloween parade. And that really, getting involved with the Puppet Guild and working nights on this with other occupiers, started really get me more motivated, involved. And then in 60 Wall Street, a lot of meetings were taking place of many different Occupy groups at the time, and I started visiting some of the other ones. And eventually I started, being an artist in Occupy museums. I had heard of that and read about some of the events taking place. And then in 2012, I joined with them in early 2012. And a lot of the meetings that it's started to shaping different actions and events, and in some cases because of work I couldn't join in some of these, and other times later that stemmed just sort of steamrolled into more and more. In 2012 we were invited to the Berlin Biennale, and there was actually about 12 of us from Occupy Museums at that point, and that went out there. And then after we came back, we had set up a project at Momenta Art. We've worked with them before. One show was actually cut off at the end because of Hurricane Sandy, but later we set up one where it was a group show where we had little maquettes made of debt fair. It was the first idea of that, just little tabletop ones.
Kiko, you can just jump in here anytime.
Okay, sure. I was just nodding my head because of Momenta, because I also have an affiliation with them as well. They've supported me in the past. As is Artist Space, which gave me $500 to build an installation in a Manhattan mini storage. So I'll be forever grateful to them for that. But anyway, as you were saying, you were talking about your how you got from being a artist to Right, okay.
So I think we left off where you decided debt fair, the first form it took was of a table.
There was 3 tabletops, approximately 2 to 3 foot, was the footprint, about 3.5 foot off the ground, and there was a little, almost like little architectural models, and one was of a debt fair. We're thinking, what about art, related to art fair, but related to debt. So if this was to be held at an art fair, what would this look like? We also did another model of what if this was in a gallery, if debt fair was in a gallery, a different scale, different setting. And in both of those, from that point, we had the little maquettes had the sheetrock cut out of different shapes. That's what started that idea. And little small miniaturized versions of artworks that were placed in between the 2x4s and over the tops of some of the sheetrock walls. And actually, we had a couple of mentions and very good comments about that. And Art League Houston actually picked us up and said, we'd like you to realize this in Houston, Texas, and come down and we'll fly you out. They flew us all out there, 5 of us, twice, and there was an art house, and we spoke and did a call for entries for the statewide for Texas, and returned back to set it up, and made pamphlets and press releases. And it turned out that after that show, it looked really good, clean documentation, and that started some conversations later from couple of the curators at the Whitney. And
So I want to jump to that. So this year you were at the Whitney Biennial,
yeah,
represent as debt fair,
Well-
and that seems to be quite a, I don't know, not a dichotomy probably isn't the word. It seems, but you have a museum that costs about as much as a Leonardo, having an exhibition involving artist debt, where you're surrounded by artists who usually have come from a completely different backgrounds. That's the story with most artists, right?
So, Jason, I love that we've transitioned into evaluating an expensive museum by the price of one single Leonardo da Vinci. I'm just glad we're in that moment now. Finally.
We have turned that corner. But where do you go? Like, what are the next steps, and how do you reconcile with the kind of financial support you're now receiving, or even institutional support you're receiving, in trying to talk about artist debt in general?
Well, just to clarify, it was from the Whitney Biennial, the artist group, our group Occupy Museum was the named artist, and the project was titled Debt Fair.
Wow.
And
Thank you.
we're continuing to, there was over 508 applicants or artists rather, that joined Debt Fair, that filled out a rather lengthy questionnaire and uploaded images of their artworks, and from there we selected 30 that actually were installed in the Whitney walls. And some of it too, we have a continuation of that. We have several plans going about now on how to sort of dig in and read into some of those 500 and plus applicants of those artists, and to further tell the story about debt. And there's also different projects related to that that are forming and are possibilities now, but nothing set in stone. And as far as the it isn't really like we were receiving a windfall of money for this. In fact, it's a lot of work and not much payoff. They are available for sale as bundles, 3 sets of 10 bundles, but that didn't transpire as of yet. So
I thought that piece was one of the strongest pieces in the biennial.
thank you.
It's the one that actually, when I mentioned the biennial, people actually do talk about that, just unsolicited. There you are.
On a stylistic standpoint, it's a bit overwhelming, but that's why you remember it. And also, when you have hordes of those group tours come through, it just sticks right out. And the other thing I want to say about that piece was I saw a docent give her own kind of opinion about it, and sort of alluding to a museum kind of being able to critique itself, or maybe they could have like maybe done something else, or she was sort of making a point that you know, the museum could have done something more. I don't know, but I thought it was really kind of powerful moment there too, like just a human being talking about a real problem and acknowledging that the institution that she kind of works for, you know, things aren't, you know, hunky-dory. So I appreciated that.
Yeah. I would like to give a shout out to the other Occupied Museum members, core members. There's 5 of us: Imani, Jacqueline Brown, Kenneth Petrobono, Talberi, and Noah Fisher. So it's us 5 who all work to set that up and are working in the future for some other things.
Well, it sounds great. We just have time for maybe, I think, one more small bit, and then we'll have to move to the next segment.
Sure.
Arthur, I guess the other thing is that, as an artist, how do you operate as an artist with also, when it seems to me, and maybe it's just my opinion, your other involvement in other projects seem to be getting more publicity and begin taking off, that you also have your own individual practice. What's your plan for all of that?
Well, when we found out about the Whitney, which went up in March this year, we heard last year in June, but it was sort of silent, couldn't reveal anything until the announcement in November 2017, or 16, excuse me, that at that point, all of us had weekly meetings, like 2 or 3 hour meetings every week, and conference calls, and individually put 5 hours a week, individually at least, every week since then. So I did put my painting practice on hold, and I work in acrylic, and it's been smaller patches at times when I can now. So it's now that the biennial is completed, that project, that iteration of Debt Fair is completed, I intend to continue on making smaller-ish works.
I think when I saw you like a couple of days ago, I was like, hey, what'd you do this weekend? And you're just like, oh, I painted in my living room.
Yeah.
I painted. Nice. Okay, I think that's the end of this segment. Who was it sponsored by, Chris?
Today, our sponsor were the threatened caribou herds that drilling in the Arctic have threatened, particularly threatening.
We started with the Arctic drilling, and we're ending with the Arctic drilling.
That seems to be the sponsor,
Okay.
though. The host of the segment, in fact, was actually appropriate. The Salvatore Mundi. What a
There are no
lucky
accidents.
catch. There are no accidents. Salvatore Mundi. What is global inequity in a fake painting, Alex? For 500.
Nice. So my thanks to Arthur and also Akiko for coming up to the table and taking copious notes. Lots of notes. Too many notes to actually talk. And I guess our DJ will get us our music and sign us off.
We are old souls,
Thank you.
protectors of the earth, guardians of children, worshippers of the moon, mermaids of the ocean. We are followers of the sun and women of magic. We are witches. We protect nature and fight against darkness. And we live in harmony amongst ourselves and protect each other at all costs. I carry the spirits of the ancients and come from a long line of wise women of the Taino and Yoruban people from deep in the Caribbean. Witches who lived by nature.
Butterfly wings, wrapped in the spring. And I'm golden from my toes and I'm reading poems and I'm singing songs. Got the neo soul, I got it tongue tight. See it in my eyes, see it in my thigh. Rolling around, singing no frown. Figure of speech, analogy, simile, an allegory. Rhymes get me tongue tied, speech of my third eye. Angels on my side, rain that is God's cry. summoning the shaman sound, bathing dirt in the ground. Now there's village and people, we all play our part. There's naked children running on about, mothers and sisters, daughters and sons, room for everyone.